In 1987, 4 foster children vanished overnight from a state-licensed group home in southern Illinois. Their foster father claimed they ran away. The police closed the case in less than 72 hours. 36 years later, during a property demolition, a hidden basement was discovered, sealed behind drywall. What they found inside reopened a case the state never wanted solved. This is the story of the foster father with records, and the children the system forgot. Before we move forward, don't forget to subscribe. May 17, 2023. Location: Carter Ridge, Illinois. Former Simmons Group home property. The house was supposed to come down quietly. A single-story structure built in 1958, long abandoned, weather-rotted, and sagging under its own weight. The demolition crew had been instructed to clear the lot for a community park, part of a grant project to revitalize forgotten spaces. But by 9:47 a.m., the excavator had stopped cold. Not because of resistance in the foundation, but because the operator had seen something he couldn't explain. A second basement wall, behind the first. And behind that, a narrow staircase descending into pitch-black space no one knew existed. A foreman descended first, his flashlight beam slicing through decades of dust and mildew. The walls were concrete. The air was dead still. And when he reached the bottom, he saw them. 4 metal bed frames, side by side, rusted but intact. A single pair of children's shoes still sat beneath one. On the far wall, a bulletin board filled with Polaroids. No one spoke for several long seconds. Then someone whispered, "Is this real?" They sealed the site and called the sheriff. By noon, the coroner and crime scene unit were on site. By sundown, the past had come back, violent, suffocating, and undeniable. August 15th, 1987. Location: Carter Ridge, Illinois. Simmons foster home. The sun had only just cleared the soybean fields when Lester Simmons told the 911 operator that 4 foster children in his care had vanished. He sounded calm, unusually calm for a man claiming that 3 boys and a little girl had disappeared sometime before dawn. His voice was clipped, matter-of-fact, like he was reporting a dog run off. "Yes, ma'am, they're gone. The door was open when I woke up. Shoes, too. They must have slipped out sometime early." By the time Deputy Raylene Hobbs pulled up the gravel drive, the morning haze was still sitting over the fields. The Simmons house was small but tidy. Yellow siding, green shutters, aluminum awning bent at one corner. A red bicycle lay on its side near the porch, its back wheel slowly spinning. Lester stood out front with a ceramic mug and a rag tucked into his back pocket. Colleen, his wife, lingered behind the screen door, arms crossed tight over her chest, her expression unreadable. Hobbs stepped out of the cruiser and tried to read the man before her. Lester Simmons had the posture of someone who believed deeply in order. Every shirt he wore was tucked in, his belt never sagged, and from what she'd seen during a few earlier calls, his house was as disciplined as he was. He gestured toward the door. "Beds were empty. Backpacks are gone. You'll want to see for yourself." The children's room looked more like a dormitory than a bedroom. 2 sets of bunk beds, sheets pulled taut. No posters, no toys. The closets were empty. The windows were shut. The screens were intact. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. She crouched near one of the beds and brushed her hand across the dusty floorboards. No footprints, no scuff marks, no obvious sign that 4 children had walked out of this house hours earlier. But the air was wrong. Stale. Like something had been closed up for too long. She walked back to the kitchen and asked to see the basement. Lester hesitated. "I keep it locked." "You keep a basement locked with kids in the house?" "It's not finished. Storage and tools. Safety issue." The door was unlocked when they reached it. The padlock hung broken from the hinge. Hobbs stepped down onto the cool concrete floor and blinked as her eyes adjusted. Storage shelves lined the walls, neat, organized, color-coded bins. A workbench, some old furniture, and at the far end of the room, a second door. Metal. No knob, just a latch. She turned to him. "What's in there?" Lester rubbed the back of his neck. "Just another storage room. It doesn't go anywhere. Built it myself." But he didn't offer the key. And the door stayed closed. By afternoon, the case was being casually referred to as a runaway incident. Sheriff Winfield didn't see the need for an all-hands search. "Kids like that," he said, "they've got reasons to go." The file was thin, just a paragraph describing each child. Thomas, age 13, withdrawn, history of anger issues. Evie, age 11, protective of younger kids, writes in journals. Marcus, age 9, fidgety, prone to stealing. Laurel, age 6, shy, bedwetter, speech delays. Hobbs stared at the sheet, then at the grainy Polaroid clipped to the corner. Laurel's expression was unreadable, eyes just barely meeting the camera lens. "They didn't run," Hobbs told her partner later that night. "Then what do you think happened?" She hesitated. The words felt dangerous, even in private. "I think they were removed." 3 days passed with no sightings. No one matching their descriptions showed up at hospitals, gas stations, bus depots. The Simmonses agreed to take polygraphs. Both passed. DCFS conducted a brief home review and left with a glowing summary. Clean residence, structured discipline, well-documented foster care logs. No red flags, no follow-ups. And by the end of the month, their foster license had quietly been renewed. 36 years later, when the basement was uncovered during renovations, the state called it a structural anomaly, an undocumented sub-level beneath the original foundation. A single room, no windows, concrete walls, a narrow cot bolted to the floor, and beside it, a metal filing cabinet. The cabinet held 4 folders, each one labeled with a child's name in crisp block letters. Thomas, Evie, Marcus, Laurel. They weren't photocopies. They were original state files, intake forms, handwritten notes, dosage schedules. One page marked in red ink read, "Laurel, still resists night training. Cried for mother again, increased to 4 milligrams if wake cycles persist." There was no DCFS seal on the page, no initials. No one had any idea who had written it. May 18th, 2023. Location: Carter Ridge, Illinois. Sheriff's Department. The call from the excavation crew came just before noon. Sheriff Lyle Mercer had only half finished his coffee when his deputy pushed open the door with a look that made him stand. "They found more than just concrete," she said. The Simmons property had sat untouched since the foreclosure in 1996. Locals said it was cursed. Vandals had broken the windows out years ago, and most of the roof had caved in. But a developer had recently purchased the land with plans to bulldoze and build luxury rentals. Nobody expected the ground to hold secrets. Mercer arrived to find 2 workers, pale and shaking, sitting on the bumper of a backhoe. One had thrown up in the dirt. The site supervisor led him to what they uncovered beneath a slab of concrete that used to be the back patio. A sealed metal hatch, partially rusted but intact. When pried open, it revealed a flight of cement steps descending into the earth. The air below was cold, still, and smelled of rot and iron. Mercer descended with a flashlight and 2 deputies behind him. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not a whisper of air. No sound from above, just the echo of their boots on the concrete. The second was the cot, bolted to the far wall. Thin mattress, rusted frame, dried red-brown stains at the corners. Then, the cabinet. It was locked, but not securely. The latch had corroded over time. Inside were 4 manila folders, each surprisingly well-preserved. Names in neat handwriting. Each matched the names from the 1987 Missing Persons Report. Mercer didn't speak. He just stared, hand tightening around the flashlight. The 4th folder, Laurel, was thinner than the rest. Inside, a single Polaroid showed a little girl sitting in the corner of a windowless room, legs tucked up, eyes dull. A date scrawled at the bottom, July 28th, 1987. And on the back, a note in the same tidy handwriting. Does not respond to external stimuli, possibly unfit for cycle 4. Mercer called in state investigators within the hour. By morning, Elena Rivas arrived from Springfield. She specialized in historic child welfare cases, mostly forgotten ones, where records were scattered and survivors long gone. She stepped into the basement wearing gloves, boots, and a look that said she'd seen too much, but never this. "What's the square footage?" she asked quietly. 10 by 10, no plumbing, one light fixture, no ventilation. No evidence of recent entry? None. The hatch was sealed tight. Had to cut through 2 inches of concrete. Rivas bent near the cot and picked up a small, square object wrapped in dust and hair. She turned it over. A plastic hospital wristband, stained and cracked. The name was faded, but under the flashlight beam she could just make it out. Laurel back at the sheriff's department. Mercer reopened the long, cold Simmons case file. It had only ever been a dozen pages. No physical evidence had been collected. No search warrants were issued. The final entry in the file was from Deputy Hobbs, dated August 24th, 1987. No signs of forced entry. Parents cooperative, interviewed separately, both passed polygraph. Recommendation, no further action at this time. That was it. No mention of the basement. No follow-up on the broken lock. Mercer flipped back to the witness statements. Hobbs had written something unusual under the observations section. Children's beds made with unnatural precision. No clothing left behind. Room had smell of bleach. She hadn't pressed further. Maybe she'd wanted to. Maybe someone had told her not to. That evening, Mercer drove out to visit Raylene Hobbs. She lived in a farmhouse on the outskirts of town now, retired and hard of hearing but sharp in the eyes. When he told her what they'd found, she didn't look surprised. Instead, she sighed and reached for a shoebox from the cabinet beneath her TV. Inside were clippings, photos, copies of reports, and a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case labeled Thomas, Basement Recording, August 87. "I kept it," she said. "Never turned it in." "Don't ask me why." Mercer nodded. She handed him a yellowing Polaroid of the Simmons children taken by the school photographer a month before they vanished. "They didn't run," she whispered. "I knew it, but nobody wanted to listen." That night, Mercer sat alone in his office with the tape deck plugged into an old stereo. He pressed play. For a few seconds there was nothing but static. Then a voice. Young. Male. Breathing fast. He said if we sleep long enough we forget who we were. That's what the red light's for. Laurel says we're not supposed to talk when it's on, but Evie does anyway. She still remembers her mom. Then silence again. Then a high, mechanical buzz. Then a man's voice. Calm, crisp, deliberate. Cycle 3 is not yielding the control we expected. Begin adjustment. Phase 2, dosage tomorrow. Click. Mercer sat in the dark, not moving. He rewound the tape and listened again. May 20th, 2023. Location, Springfield, Illinois. Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS. Archives. The DCFS archives sat on the edge of the industrial district, in a squat beige building with flickering lights and a smell of mildew that never fully left. Elena Rivas had been there more times than she could count, but this time felt different. She wasn't here to close a file. She was here to open one that had never really existed. The 1987 Simmons foster home record was sparse and worse, intentionally redacted. When she asked the intake librarian for the physical file, the woman gave her a look that said, "Good luck," then motioned to the aisle labeled Foster, Region 8, 1980s. Rivas pulled the box marked Simmons, L and C from the shelf. Its string seal was still intact. She undid it carefully. The first few documents were predictable. Licensing applications, home inspection reports, signed affidavits about discipline methods. A clean paper trail. Too clean. Then she found the placement ledger. A list of every child placed with the Simmonses, complete with case numbers, intake dates, and reassignments. 4 names were clearly visible. Thomas Green, March 1986, Evelyn Dunn, June 1986, Marcus Hill, October 1986, Laurel H., January 1987. The last name had no case number, no last name spelled out, just a faint handwritten note next to it in black ink. Unnumbered placement, do not index. Phase 1 start date pending. Her skin went cold. Foster placements didn't have phases. Labs had phases. She flipped through the folder again, faster now. In the back pocket was a small wrinkled sheet of yellow paper. Different texture. Older. The top simply read, Project Clementine. And underneath, a list of directives. Cycle durations 7 to 10 days. Subjects not to speak outside red light hours, do not reassign incomplete subjects. All recordings to be labeled numerically only, reintegration discouraged unless behavioral reset is achieved. Rivas closed the file slowly, hands trembling. This wasn't foster care. It wasn't even behavioral research. This was conditioning. Back in Carter Ridge, Mercer stood outside the old Simmons house as a second forensic team arrived. Word was starting to spread. Local news vans hovered just off the property line, and reporters circled like buzzards. The team prepared to break into the wall adjacent to the first basement room. There were inconsistencies in the layout, a discrepancy in the foundation thickness. When the drywall came down, it revealed a narrow passage. A second room, much smaller, 4 feet wide, maybe 6 feet long. Inside, a child's cot, a bucket, and a mounted speaker in one corner. Above the cot, drawn in red crayon, were 4 stick figures, one taller than the rest, the other 3 grouped together. A speech bubble hovered over the tallest one. The words, childishly spelled, read, "Don't tell. No one will come." Back in Carter Ridge, Mercer stood outside the old Simmons house as a second forensic team arrived. Word was starting to spread. Local news vans hovered just off the property line, and reporters circled like buzzards. The team prepared to break into the wall adjacent to the first basement room. There were inconsistencies in the layout, a discrepancy in the foundation thickness. When the drywall came down, it revealed a narrow passage. A second room, much smaller, 4 feet wide, maybe 6 feet long. Inside, a child's cot, a bucket, and a mounted speaker in one corner. Above the cot, drawn in red crayon, were 4 stick figures, one taller than the rest, the other 3 grouped together. A speech bubble hovered over the tallest one. The words, childishly spelled, read, "Don't tell. No one will come." That evening, Rivas and Mercer met at the sheriff's office. She laid out everything she'd found. The placement files, the directive sheet, the references to cycle phases and red light hours. The fact that Laurel's full name didn't exist anywhere in the DCFS system. She was never meant to be tracked, Rivas said. She wasn't processed like the others. My guess is she was placed outside protocol, off the books. Mercer stared at the drawing photos from the second room. And the rest of them. They were real, but I think they were selected specifically, taken for traits, behavioral profiles, and then tested. He looked up at her. Tested for what? She exhaled slowly. Obedience, erasure, psychological suppression. I don't know yet. But it wasn't just abuse. This was systemic, cold, measured. Mercer didn't say anything for a long time. Then he walked to the evidence cabinet and opened a drawer marked Media-2023 Recovery. Inside were 6 VHS tapes recovered from the metal cabinet. He placed the first one into the converted player. Black screen. Then a sharp buzz. Then a boy's face. Marcus. Staring into the lens. His voice was hollow, his expression flat. Day 3. They moved Tommy. He didn't finish the cycle. Evie doesn't talk now. Laurel stares at the light and forgets her name. The screen flickered. A man's voice off camera. Marcus, what happens if you speak during the red light? A pause. Then Marcus answered. I disappear. May 21st, 2023. Location, Carter Ridge, Illinois. Local elementary school, closed. The next morning, Elena Rivas stood outside the rusted chain-link fence of Carter Ridge Elementary School. It had closed in the early 90s after enrollment dropped too low. But back in 1987, it was where all 4 children, Thomas, Evie, Marcus, and Laurel, had been enrolled for at least part of the school year. Records showed sparse attendance for the older 3 and virtually none for Laurel. She wasn't here for the school itself, but for what was stored inside. According to town records, the old principal, Mr. Vernon Odell, had donated a bulk of old school files, photos, emergency cards, psychological assessments, to the Carter Ridge Historical Society before his retirement. The Historical Society, in turn, had stuffed most of it into a back room of the school's east wing, waiting for someone who cared enough to organize it. Rivas stepped over the sagging threshold and walked the long, dusty hallway until she found the room with the painted Faculty Storage sign still dangling from one screw. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and forgotten paper. Rows of metal file cabinets lined the walls, each with fading labels. She started with the drawer marked 1986 to 87 student records. Thomas's file was first, flagged twice for sudden behavioral outbursts and missing days. One note, dated March 2nd, simply read, Tommy asked if he still had a brother. Unsure what prompted this question, Evie's folder included a poem, written in her handwriting, scrawled across a sheet of lined paper. Red light on, red light stay. If you talk, you go away. Blue light means it's time to cry. Don't ask questions. Don't ask why. Rivas's stomach turned. It was a nursery rhyme, an instructional verse passed from one child to another, a coping mechanism. Then Marcus's file. The cover sheet was stamped withdrawn. The withdrawal form claimed relocation as the reason. The date, July 24th, 1987, 3 weeks before they vanished. Except Marcus had never left the house. Finally, Laurel. No file. Not even a name in the enrollment ledger. She had never officially existed within the school system. Later that day, back at the sheriff's office, Mercer got a visit from someone unexpected. A woman in her 40s. Sharp eyes, nervous hands. She introduced herself as Hannah Coulter. I was placed with the Simmonses, before the others. He sat her down gently. What year? Spring of 85. I was 10. Her voice trembled. They were strange. Everything had to be perfect. We weren't allowed to talk after sundown. The lights would go red in the hallway. Not regular lights, just bulbs they put in. Said it was part of the rules. She paused. Her hands were shaking now. Lester had this room in the basement. He said it was for quiet time. Said it helped when you were broken. Mercer swallowed. Were you ever sent there? She nodded. 3 times. But I didn't break, so they moved me. I told my next foster mom what happened. She called me a liar. He took a breath. Do you remember anyone named Laurel? Hannah blinked hard, then slowly nodded. She was small, quiet. Lester didn't let her eat at the table with us. Said she needed special adjustment. I never saw her again after June. She pulled something from her purse. A photo. Grainy, old. It showed a group of foster kids, maybe 6, sitting on a blanket in the yard. Hannah circled in the back. Evie, Marcus, and Thomas were recognizable. And off to the right, half cut from the frame, was a girl barely visible. Dark curls, barefoot, shoulders hunched. "Laurel," she whispered. That night, Rivas sat alone in her hotel room, spreading the photos and documents across the bed. She kept returning to that list from Project Clementine, the coded language, the phrases like behavioral reset, cycle 3, reassignment discouraged. It wasn't just psychological abuse, it was patterned, institutional, designed. And Laurel. Laurel was the control, the one they tested harder, or the one who survived longest. She opened her laptop and began building a timeline. Arrival dates, behavioral notes, photos, timestamps from the VHS tapes. When she overlaid the red light entries across the diary excerpts and incident dates, a chilling pattern emerged. Every red light incident was followed within 48 hours by the disappearance or suppression of a child. One vanished, another went silent, another stopped asking questions. The red light wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The next morning, a lab technician called with results from the testing done on materials recovered from the Simmons basement. One item stood out. Fibers recovered from the cot mattress in the second room contained traces of flufenazine, an antipsychotic medication typically used to sedate adult patients in mental institutions. In the 1980s, it had been used in extreme, often unethical behavioral control programs, usually involving children in state custody. Rivas stared at the report, heart pounding. They weren't disciplining foster kids. They were experimenting on them. May 22nd, 2023. Location: Southern Illinois University. Department of Behavioral Sciences Archive. Elena Rivas, parked in a visitor space marked with peeling yellow paint, gripping the file folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had no official appointment, but she didn't need one. Not when she knew what she was looking for and how well the university buried its worst projects. Southern Illinois had hosted a number of state-funded behavioral research initiatives throughout the 70s and 80s. Most were conventional: addiction recovery, adolescent trauma, family systems models. But tucked beneath the legitimate studies were whispers of more experimental work, projects that didn't always make it to peer-reviewed journals. She signed in as a researcher, showed her credentials, and followed a clerk into the basement archive level, a space that smelled of mothballs and warm paper. She asked about Project Clementine. The clerk blinked, then left her alone in the stacks. 10 minutes later, he returned with a single document, a proposal, yellowed and brittle at the corners, dated 1983, stamped unfunded at the top. But the outline was unmistakable. Principal Investigator, Dr. L. Simmons. Affiliation, Independent Research Partner with SIU Behavioral Sciences Division. Title, Behavioral Disruption. Recovery and Identity Reassociation in State Wards, Project Clementine. Her eyes scanned the lines. Goal: to evaluate erasure and imprinting models using repeated sensory conditioning in child subjects under controlled environments. Duration: up to 18 months per cohort. Subject pool: wards of the state between 6 to 12 years of age, with no confirmed familial ties or expected rehoming. Control variables: isolation, sensory restriction, audiovisual repetition, chemical sedation. Phase 3 projection includes assessment of long-term dissociation and behavioral compliance patterns. The document claimed no harm, in bold across the bottom. Rivas felt her skin crawl. This was not an abandoned idea. It was simply rerouted, off paper and into places like the Simmons foster home. She checked the bottom of the document again. A signature, partially faded. Dr. Lester Simmons. The man hadn't just operated the foster home. He had designed the program. Back in Carter Ridge, Mercer pulled open a drawer in his desk labeled Old Cold Case Interviews and searched for a name that had haunted the 1987 case but never made it into the public report. Carol Simmons, Lester's wife. In the official files, her statements were brief, almost robotic. She claimed the children had left without warning, that she had no idea where they went, that they were troubled and difficult. She'd passed her polygraph. There had been no charges. But Mercer noticed something strange. Her signature on the custody forms wasn't consistent. And in a side note written by Deputy Hobbs, there was a scribbled sentence. Carol asked if they found the photos yet, then went silent when asked to clarify. No follow-up had been done. Mercer stood, grabbed his coat, and drove across town. Carol Simmons was still alive, now living in a nursing home under her maiden name, Caroline Meyer. The facility was clean and quiet, but the woman who met him in room 204 was barely present. Thin, pale, eyes cloudy with age. He sat beside her, showing an old photo of Thomas and Evie. She didn't react at first. Then, her lips parted. Just slightly. They hummed to themselves, she said softly. All the time, like they were afraid of silence. Mercer leaned closer. Who told them to be afraid of silence? She blinked. Lester said noise meant disobedience. Silence meant reset. He said they'd learn eventually. Mercer's voice dropped. Where is Lester? She looked out the window. He's gone. Long time now. But he left something. A room only he had the key for. He kept the tapes there. What tapes? Her eyes filled with something. Grief, maybe guilt. Where he practiced his voice. So they'd obey it. Mercer called Rivas as soon as he left the home. I think there's another room. Somewhere else. The one she mentioned. It was separate from the basement. Rivas was quiet for a moment. Then said, the Simmons house had a detached garage, didn't it? Mercer's silence was confirmation. That evening, they returned to the property under floodlights. The garage had been overlooked during the initial sweep. Roof caved in. Front half burned out decades ago. But the concrete base was still sound, and in the far right corner, behind collapsed shelving and a rusted water heater, was a trap door hidden beneath layers of soot and insulation. The lock had fused shut with rust. They pried it open. The ladder led down to a space smaller than the basement, closer to a bunker. The air was colder, almost preserved, and along the back wall were stacked dozens of VHS tapes, each marked with a date and only one letter. T-M-E-L Thomas, Marcus, Evie, Laurel. Rivas pulled one at random, L, August 1st, 1987, and fed it into the portable monitor they'd brought. The screen was black for a moment, then static, then Laurel's face. She was no older than 6, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. She rocked slowly, mumbling something inaudible. Then a male voice from off-camera, calm, precise. Tell me your number. She didn't answer. The voice repeated, Tell me your number. Laurel's lips moved, barely audible. 4. You are not a name. You are not a memory. You are 4. The screen cut to black. Rivas shut off the player and exhaled shakily. She wasn't even a person to them, she said. Mercer looked at the stack. There are 50 more tapes down here. He turned to her. How many more kids were there that never got recorded? May 23rd, 2023. Location, Carter Ridge, Illinois. Simmons property, evidence processing site. By mid-morning, a full forensic team was on the scene. The garage's sublevel, now referred to internally as Room 3, was officially designated a crime scene. Cataloging the tapes became the priority. Each was photographed, bagged, and labeled. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. This was bigger than Carter Ridge, bigger than a missing persons case. The Department of Justice had already been notified. Elena Rivas sat in a folding chair just outside the tape perimeter, watching as technicians carefully removed each VHS from the shelf. She held the one labeled L Final in her lap. There was no date, just the word Final, scrawled in red ink. She hadn't watched it yet. She wasn't ready. Not until she knew who Laurel really was. Because whoever Laurel had been before that house, that room, and that program, she was the key. The others had files, names, even school records. But Laurel, she had only a number. Rivas turned to the man from records who'd arrived with a cross-checking list from the state foster care database. Run any child in Region 8 listed as missing between 1985 and 1988, she told him, especially those without birth certificates. He frowned. You're looking for ghosts. She nodded. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Across town, Mercer visited the last living deputy who had worked the original 1987 case. Joe Hobbs, now 77 and confined to a nursing facility after a stroke. Hobbs's room was cluttered with books, old photographs, and a locked file box. Mercer brought coffee and the photo of the children. I didn't forget them, Hobbs said, his voice raspy. Nobody ever really asked, but I didn't forget. Why didn't you push harder back then? Mercer asked. Hobbs stared at the picture. We did. You think we didn't? But every time we brought up those kids, we got shut down. Not by the locals, by state offices. Men in suits would show up. Records disappeared. They told us to classify it as a runaway group. No press, no follow-up. He motioned to the locked box beside his bed. Got tired of watching everything vanish, so I kept copies. Mercer opened the box. Inside were Xeroxed reports, a few Polaroids, and most startling, a hand-drawn map. It was the layout of the Simmons house, but it included a part no official blueprint ever showed. Prep room. Phase room. Control room. Mercer scanned the margin notes. A line had been underlined 3 times. Phase room 2 accessible only via tunnel. Entry disguised under floor grate. Mercer closed the box. There were more rooms. Back on the Simmons property, a ground-penetrating radar scan was already underway around the rear acreage. Just after 3 p.m., one of the operators called out, "There's something beneath the fire pit." They cleared the charred debris, revealing a circular iron grate bolted into the soil. Below it, barely wide enough for one person at a time, was a tunnel entrance, lined in concrete and running under the rear shed. It took nearly an hour to reach the end. There was a final room. This one wasn't like the others. It wasn't for control. It wasn't for watching. It was for containment. The walls were lined with heavy insulation. There was no bed, no speaker, no light. Just padded walls, scratch marks, and, in the center, a steel restraint chair bolted to the floor. Mercer stood staring at it. Why build this? Rivas didn't answer for several seconds, then said, "This wasn't a foster home. It was a human lab." They photographed everything, collected trace evidence, swabbed for blood, skin, anything that might remain. And then Rivas finally watched the tape marked "Final." It began like the others, static, hum, black screen. Then Laurel's face, older now, maybe 7. She sat still in the dark, lit only by a single bulb swinging overhead. The voice came from behind the camera, calmer than ever. "4, what is your purpose?" She didn't speak. "4, what is your purpose?" Laurel stared into the lens. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "To be forgotten." The camera zoomed in. Her pupils dilated under the harsh light. The voice again. "And what do we do when the door opens?" A pause. Then, "We close our eyes." The screen went black. Rivas turned it off. She couldn't stop shaking. That night, the DOJ agents arrived. They took over the case officially, federal jurisdiction. But Rivas and Mercer stayed involved. As consultants, they insisted. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. There were dozens of tapes. And the worst part wasn't what they'd already seen. It was the empty space at the end of the shelf. Enough room for many more. May 25th, 2023. Location, Carter Ridge, Illinois. State Juvenile Records Facility. The sky was overcast when Elena Rivas arrived at the Regional Juvenile Records Office. an aging brick building that smelled faintly of damp paper and pine sol. She was met by a clerk named Jared, who, after seeing the federal case badge hanging from her neck, offered no resistance. "We've pulled everything from 85 to 88. There were 24 kids placed with the Simmonses in that time," he said, unlocking a back office filled with boxes. "But something's off. There are no medical records on file for some of them, no intake photos. In fact," he paused, flipping open a folder, "some of these kids were never listed in our central tracking system, only in the foster placement logbooks. Ghosts again." Elena opened the first box. Each folder was a life reduced to bullet points. Name, date of birth, intake notes, behavioral warnings, placement dates. But one folder stood out. It was blank except for a single intake form. No name, no date of birth. Just a case number, C-0387-4. She stared at the designation. Clementine, March 1987. Subject 4, Laurel. There was no photo, but the bottom of the form noted, "Subject does not respond to birth name. Referred to by numerical assignment only." Elena felt the nausea rise. The system had accepted this, legitimized it. A sticky note on the back read, "Contact Dr. L. Simmons before transferring. Requires modified intake." There it was. Proof. The department had sanctioned this intake with prior consultation from Lester Simmons, which meant this wasn't just a rogue foster parent. This was an orchestrated system of abuse, supported by negligence, or worse, complicity. Meanwhile, back at the Simmons property, Mercer stood beside the forensic team as they completed the excavation beneath the fire pit tunnel. They'd found the restraint chair, but now, 2 feet below the concrete pad, cadaver dogs had alerted again. They lifted a square of soil, revealing what appeared to be a sealed wooden box. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and duct tape, were clothing fragments, a small pink sweater, a denim pant leg, and beneath them, a child's shoe, still tied. Too small for Marcus, too small for Evie. Laurel. They sent the materials for DNA analysis, but Mercer already knew. "She never left that room," he said. "He broke her, and then buried what was left." The soil around the box held fragments of human tissue, but no full remains. Just trace. Too old for full recovery. The final resting place of Subject 4. That evening, Elena met Mercer at a local diner. Neither touched their food. "You know what this means," she said. He nodded. "If they funded even one intake, then the whole department is liable." She slid a printed list across the table. "I traced Simmons's funding sources. He wasn't just getting payments for the foster home. There were research stipends, small, unmarked disbursements made through a non-profit affiliated with the Department of Youth Services." Mercer scanned the paper. They masked it as a behavioral compliance study. "It was a cover," she said. "They were testing suppression protocols under the guise of therapeutic care. And kids like Laurel, quiet, traumatized, undocumented, were the perfect candidates." "What about the nonprofit?" "Dissolved in 1994. But the paper trail exists. I've got a financial analyst running it backward." She paused, lowering her voice. "It might go higher than Simmons." Mercer looked at her. "You think this was just one location in a bigger program?" She didn't answer immediately, then said, "I think Carter Ridge was a prototype." At 11:12 p.m., a lab technician from the FBI field office called. "We got something off the tape heads, one of the unmarked reels. It had background chatter, like someone forgot to mute the audio while filming." "What kind of chatter?" "Male voices, 2 of them, and a phone number, spoken out loud, mid-conversation." Rivas sat up. "Play it for me." She listened. Faint, grainy, but the voice was unmistakable. Not Simmons. It was someone else. Calm, professional. "We'll test 4 again tomorrow. Keep her sedated. If she fails auditory repetition, transfer the file to Watson Ridge. Use the alt code for transfer, 3619. Got it? Another voice. 3619, same as last month. Got it. Rivas froze. Watson Ridge wasn't a facility. It was a juvenile psychiatric center 200 miles north, closed in 1998 after reports of severe misconduct and funding irregularities. 3619 wasn't a transfer code. It was a project designation. There were other sites. May 27, 2023. Location: Watson Ridge, Illinois, site of former juvenile psychiatric center. The Watson Ridge campus had been shuttered for 25 years, but the building still stood, gray and monolithic, a skeleton of state-run childhood trauma. Elena Rivas stood at the rusted front gate, holding a printed copy of the old intake logs and a pair of bolt cutters. No guards, no alarms, no one to stop her. She wasn't waiting for a search warrant. The property had been condemned, and if there were records still inside, they'd be buried beneath mold, rot, and indifference. Mercer met her at the entrance. He'd driven up at dawn after her 3 a.m. phone call. You think they brought other kids here? I don't think. I know, Rivas said, handing him a sheet. This number, 3619. It appears in the Simmons case files as a project reference, and it shows up here in the Watson Ridge inventory, listed under the Behavioral Isolation Unit. But none of the listed children were ever officially admitted. No photos, no medical screenings, just initials, same as the tapes. She pointed to a line on the paper. 3619-C/subject 7/transferred 11/22/87. No name? Mercer asked. Just that. Subject 7, just like Laurel was subject 4. They pushed through the side entrance and entered the west wing. The ceiling sagged and water pooled across the linoleum. The hallway smelled of mildew and old medication. Down the main corridor, behind a chain-locked door, was the wing labeled Therapeutic Behavioral Modification. They pried it open with a crowbar. Inside were 6 rooms, all windowless. 4 were empty. The 5th had a rusted-out mattress and broken furniture, but the 6th, far at the end, still had equipment inside: a gurney, restraint straps, a reel-to-reel audio system mounted on the wall. Beside it, taped to a clipboard, a final session log. Project 3619, Subject 7, Final Evaluation Response to Auditory Conditioning, failed. Response to dissociation prompts, incomplete. Transfer outcome, terminated. Status, unrecoverable. Mercer stared at the word. Terminated. They killed him, he said. They erased him, Rivas corrected. From memory, from records, maybe even from his own identity. Subject 7 didn't die. They buried whoever he used to be. That afternoon, Rivas sat across from a retired psychiatrist who had worked briefly at Watson Ridge in the late 80s. Dr. Henry Lowell was in his 80s now, living in assisted care, and claimed no direct knowledge of the experiments. But when shown the project number 3619, his eyes changed. I remember the code, he whispered. It was whispered, not spoken. Meant we were supposed to avoid contact, keep distance, children marked that way. They weren't ours. They belonged to someone else. Someone else? Rivas pressed. Private researchers, maybe. State contractors. Men in suits would come through once a month with boxes and paperwork. Kids would disappear overnight. We weren't supposed to ask. Did you ever meet Simmons? Lowell shook his head. But I saw his initials. LS. They stamped his review forms with it. And the children. Lowell looked down. Most of them didn't talk, just rocked back and forth. A few repeated things, phrases, numbers, sometimes just silence, like it had been trained into them. Back in Carter Ridge, Mercer received the preliminary DNA results from the biological trace found beneath the fire pit tunnel. It was a match. Laurel had died there. Her remains, what little could be recovered, were now the center of a federal child homicide case. But the sample wasn't just hers. There was another unidentified profile. male. Aged 9 to 11 at time of death. No match in CODIS. They'd never even known to look for a fifth child. The FBI released a limited statement to the press the following day. They cited historic systemic abuse at a former group home in rural Illinois. No names were released, no agencies admitted involvement. But people were talking. Survivors, former employees, families who remembered children placed in homes like Simmons and never heard from again. One such woman, a former caseworker named Janice Keller, emailed Elena late that night. I remember a boy we placed with Simmons. Name was Aaron, 6 years old, quiet, blonde. He disappeared within 6 months. I was told to mark it as a runaway. But I never believed it. I still don't. He used to hum when scared, always the same tune. That line stopped Rivas cold, because in one of the tapes, the second one labeled T, Thomas had sat in the corner, humming that same lullaby, over and over. Not because he liked it, because it was the only thing they hadn't taken from him yet. May 28, 2023. Location, Carter Ridge, Illinois. Regional Archive. Annex. The Regional Archive was never intended for public access. Housed in a warehouse once used by the Department of Agriculture, it had become the state's dumping ground for defunct agency files, casework, audits, psychiatric reports, and personnel records that no one had reviewed in decades. Elena Rivas stood inside the aisle marked Youth Services, Closed Facilities, 1980 to 1990. Dust motes danced in the weak overhead light. Rows upon rows of cardboard boxes loomed on shelves that stretched to the ceiling, each labeled with numbers that meant nothing without the right index. She was looking for something specific: a staff registry, employment rosters, financial records, anything to prove that Lester Simmons had not acted alone. It was Mercer who found it first, tucked in the back of a file labeled simply Compliance 1987. A photocopied letter, dated July 14, 1987, from the Department of Youth Services. To Dr. L. Simmons, Re. 3619-C, Renewal. Your grant will be extended through fiscal year 1988. Subject behavior metrics deemed acceptable. Continue monitoring of Subject 3 and 5. Discontinue Subject 4 if auditory control fails. Transfer remaining assets to Watson Ridge if termination protocols are necessary. Mercer's hands trembled as he read the rest. There were no names, no signatures, just initials at the bottom. R.H. Another puppet master. Higher up. They kept funding it even after they knew kids were dying, he said. Rivas didn't respond. She was staring at a list paper clipped to the letter. Transfer summary. Q3 1987, Subject 1. Terminated. Subject 2. Transferred. Subject 3. Active. Subject 4. Auditory non-compliance. Subject 5. Compliant. Subject 6. Not viable. Subject 7. Reassigned. 7 children. Only 4 were ever reported missing from Simmons's home. 3 were never accounted for because no one knew they existed. Later that evening, Rivas and Mercer sat in the motel room, the walls lined with case files, photocopied letters, and screenshots from the tapes. Rivas circled the numbers with a red pen. It was a controlled experiment. Each child labeled, monitored, studied. Simmons wasn't a foster parent. He was a data collector. She opened a folder marked Subject 3. It contained nothing but a child's drawing, crayon scribbles on faded paper, a house, a stick-figure family, and in the corner, a dark square with a single figure inside it. No face, just 2 hollow eyes. On the back, in a child's handwriting, I go there when I forget things. Rivas looked up. This kid's still out there. I feel it. Mercer hesitated. You think any of them survived? I think one did. Maybe more. And if they're alive, they've been carrying this in silence for 36 years. That night, an anonymous email arrived in Rivas's inbox. No text, no subject. Just an attachment. An old intake photograph of a boy, no older than 8, with sandy brown hair and a dazed look on his face. Pinned to his shirt was a paper label. Subject 5, she zoomed in. In the background was something familiar, the staircase inside Simmons's garage, the same one that led to the hidden basement. But this image was not from a government file. It had been scanned from a photo album, creased and discolored from handling. A second email came an hour later, this one with a subject line, "You're not done. You haven't seen the house on Marlin Drive." Attached was a street address. Marlin Drive was in Rock Falls, 3 hours north. There was no name, no sender information, but Elena knew exactly what it was. A survivor was trying to speak. By morning they were on the road, maps spread across the dashboard as Mercer drove. Riva stared out the window, thoughts running wild. What if Subject 5 had escaped? What if he'd lived all this time with no name, no record, no family, just a memory stitched together by trauma and silence? They arrived at the house just before noon, a small, single-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac. Overgrown hedges, mail piled up, windows sealed tight. There were no signs of life, until Mercer spotted the garage. The door was ajar by a few inches. They approached cautiously. Inside, they found boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, children's toys, VCRs, and in the center, a folding table covered in photographs. All of them showed different children, posed, unsmiling, labeled with numbers. At the far end of the table was a portable reel-to-reel player. Rivas pressed play. It was a voice, male, familiar. "They thought we forgot, but we didn't. We remember everything. We remember the tunnels, the walls, the chair. We remember the whisper games and the sleep drills. They told us we were broken." A long pause. Then, "But we are not broken. We're still here, and we are waiting." May 29th, 2023. Location, Rock Falls, Illinois. House on Marlin Drive. The house was a time capsule. Nothing inside had been touched in years, but it wasn't abandoned. It had been curated, preserved, almost as if someone had prepared it for them to find. Elena Rivas stood over the table of photos, her eyes scanning the children's faces. No names, just numbers scrawled in red marker at the bottom of each. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It wasn't just the Simmons children. Some of these faces were new, unfamiliar. One boy wore a hospital bracelet. Another had a bruised eye and held a sign that read, "Test Group B." In the corner of the room was a corkboard filled with hand-drawn maps, diagrams of buildings, arrows and names. A rough sketch of what appeared to be the Simmons house, complete with a hidden sub-basement. One diagram had been marked again and again in ink. 3619-A/network sites/transferred assets. "What is this?" Mercer asked, kneeling to examine the sketches. "A survivor's record," Elena said. "Whoever lived here was documenting the program. The whole thing." In a drawer beneath the table, Mercer found cassette tapes, dozens, labeled in precise handwriting, Subject 2, Entry Interviews Subject 4, Day 8 Observation Subject 5, Post-Restraint Response Subject 7, Transfer Processing. "This isn't just testimony," he said. "It's internal, clinical, like someone kept the program alive long after Simmons died." "No," Elena said quietly, holding up a file she'd just opened. A journal, handwritten, first person. The opening entry read, "I was Subject 5. They called me that because I wouldn't respond to my name. I was taken in March 1987. I escaped in November, but I never really left." That afternoon, they returned to the local field office and secured a forensic warrant. The house was sealed as a crime scene. Forensics combed through the garage, attic, and crawl spaces. They found no human remains, but they did find tissue samples, sealed inside specimen containers, labeled with case numbers. Hair, blood, nail clippings. Evidence, kept like trophies, or like research material. Meanwhile, in Carter Ridge, a journalist named Amy Naylor, who had been following the story quietly, contacted Rivas. She had traced the initials from the 1987 letter. R.H. Robert Helling, former Deputy Director of the Illinois Department of Youth Services, retired in 1992, living under a different name in Sarasota, Florida. "I don't have subpoena power," Rivas told Mercer, "but if he's still alive, we need to speak to him before someone silences him." They flew out the next day. Helling lived in a gated senior community. They found him sitting on his patio, sipping iced tea, the Florida sun baking the sidewalk around him. He didn't look surprised when they introduced themselves. "I always wondered how long it would take," he said. Rivas sat across from him. "How long for what?" "For someone to care," Helling replied. He admitted to authorizing the 3619C initiative. "It was sold to us as therapeutic modeling, trying to recondition trauma responses in children who were too broken for traditional placement. Simmons pitched it as a pilot, said he could make them manageable." "You knew they were being hurt," Rivas said. "I suspected," he said. "But back then, we believed kids like that were already lost. It was either that or send them to institutions. We thought we were being humane." "You gave him a blank check. We gave him children. That's worse." Later that night, Rivas listened again to the tape they'd recovered in Rock Falls. The voice of Subject 5, now a grown man, spoke with perfect clarity. "I kept the tapes, I kept the names, because someone had to. I remember Laurel. She didn't scream when it started. She just stopped talking. One day she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. I remember Thomas. He was Subject 2. They made him repeat words until he forgot his own. I remember the red door. Behind it was the place they took us when we failed the tests. I never asked what happened in there. I was too afraid. I only survived because they thought I was ready. They let me out, put me in another home, gave me a new name, a new birthday. But I remembered. I always remembered." Rivas sat back shaking. "They reassigned him," Mercer said, "moved him like a product, and somehow he survived." "Not just survived," she whispered. "He became the Archivist." May 31st, 2023. Location: Springfield, Illinois, Department of State Archives. The Archivist's voice on the tape had become a kind of guide, a survivor's chronicle of everything the state buried. As Rivas and Mercer drove back into Illinois, a silent determination settled between them. They weren't just looking for answers anymore. They were following breadcrumbs left by a child who had once been erased, and who refused to stay gone. Back in Springfield, they requested access to sealed internal memos from 1985 to 1992. Most of the files were locked under bureaucratic red tape, labeled Internal Use Only, Administrative Investigations. But one document, likely misfiled, lay in a box marked Budget Corrections, Youth Division. It was a reimbursement ledger. Rows of line items, small and easily overlooked, each referencing the Simmons home address, but listed under non-standard categories. Auditory Isolation Model, $12,412. Behavioral Redirection Protocol, $9,700. Subject Compensation, Supplemental, $5,000. Secondary Transfer Arrangement, $3,200. Subject Compensation, Mercer repeated. Who are they paying? They flipped to the back of the file. There, on a yellow carbon copy, was a signature. Illegible, but beneath it, typed neatly, Program Overseer, L. Simmons. That night, Rivas called the only living biological relative of the foster children who had vanished. Harriet Dorsey, half-sister to Laurel. She lived in a mobile home park just outside Mattoon, Illinois, and hadn't spoken publicly since her sister disappeared. The system had never returned her calls. After Simmons's arrest, no one followed up. "Did they ever let you identify Laurel's remains?" Rivas asked gently. Harriet lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. "They wouldn't even confirm it was her. Said the DNA was partial. No dental. Just told me it was most likely her. Like that was supposed to help me sleep at night." Rivas showed her the photograph of Subject 4. Harriet covered her mouth. "That's her," she whispered. "God, her eyes. She had this way of staring straight through you when she didn't trust someone, which was always, especially around him. She meant Simmons. He gave us presents when he came to pick her up, said he'd make her better. Like she was broken." She cried in the back seat the whole drive away. Harriet lowered her gaze. She was 6. The following morning, an unmarked envelope was slid under the door of Rivas's motel room. No return address, no postmark. Inside, a single Polaroid. A boy standing in a hallway, shirtless, eyes vacant. On the wall behind him, chalk marks, numbers, and tally slashes. On the back of the photo, Marlin wasn't the only house. Underneath that, a GPS coordinate. It led them to a rural patch of farmland outside Jacksonville, Illinois. The property had once been listed under a shell company, Coventry Development Trust, which, after some digging, turned out to be a front for a state behavioral health grant fund disbanded in 1994. No house stood there now, just the remnants of a concrete foundation overtaken by weeds. But beneath a buried slab in what had once been the basement, the forensic team found 6 audio reels sealed in an oil drum. Each was labeled with a subject number and a single word: exit. Rivas played one of them that night. "This is subject 6. They said I was not viable, that I couldn't learn. But I remembered one thing. I remembered my brother. He was subject 2. They took him away first. He screamed until he couldn't anymore." She shut off the tape. At dawn, the Rock Falls house was burned to the ground. A neighbor reported a strange vehicle parked nearby just hours earlier. The forensics team was still inside. One analyst was injured but escaped. The rest of the evidence, tapes, files, photos, gone. Arson was suspected. Accelerants were confirmed. Rivas stared at the ashes as they cooled, her hands clenched. "They're watching us," she said. "They've always been watching," Mercer replied. "We just didn't know where to look." She turned to him. "Then we make them look back." June 2nd, 2023. Location: Carter Ridge, Illinois, former Simmons property. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of overcast that made shadows stretch in every direction. Rivas stood alone at the edge of the demolition site, watching bulldozers carve through the remains of the Simmons property. Everything had been leveled: the house, the foundation, even the garage, but not the soil beneath it. Because beneath that soil, the truth had already started to rise. The new forensic team, contracted out of state, had exhumed 3 shallow burial sites beneath the concrete slab. 2 contained partial remains, confirmed as children under the age of 10. 1 was skeletal, wrapped in burlap, arms folded across the chest as though posed. The 3rd grave was empty, nothing but a cloth doll, its face burned off, laid carefully in the center. A matchbook rested beside it, its cover printed with the name Watson Ridge, Better Beginnings for Children. Rivas didn't recognize the name, but Mercer did. It was another group home, closed in '89, quietly, no arrests, just disappeared from the ledger. Another node in the network. The 3619C program wasn't just Simmons. It had spread. Later that day, a final email came from the anonymous sender. No message. Just a video attachment titled, Subject 5, Confession/Closure. The screen flickered to life. A man, now in his 40s, sat in a dimly lit room. His face was partially hidden in shadow. His voice was calm, measured. My name is not important. I had many. David, Marcus, Isaac, whichever they needed for the paperwork. But my number was always the same. Subject 5. I was one of the ones who lived. They trained us to forget, to comply, to sleep on command and wake without memory. We were given foster homes as holding cells. Simmons wasn't alone. He was part of something bigger, older than I understood at the time. We weren't runaways. We were taken. By permission. The man leaned closer to the camera. But we remember now, all of us, the ones who lived. We kept notes, kept names, and we kept watching. He paused. You're not the first to look into this, but maybe you're the first who won't stop. There's a ledger, a final one. Look beneath the church, the old mission home in Grand Tower. They kept the final records there. After that, the network collapsed. Too many eyes, too much risk, but the names are still written down. Kids like me, and the ones who didn't make it. The screen faded to black. 3 days later, Rivas and Mercer drove down into Grand Tower, Illinois, a fog-covered town nestled against the Mississippi. At the edge of town stood a collapsed structure that had once been the Children's Mercy Mission home, abandoned since 1990. They found the hatch beneath what was once the chapel stage. It led to a cellar long forgotten, crumbling, mold-stricken but dry. And at the center of the room, sealed inside a rusted filing cabinet, they found what no one had expected to still exist. A registry, handwritten, page after page, names, photos, intake dates, outcome codes, each entry stamped with a number, S1 through S47. Simmons' home had only handled 7. There were 40 more. In the final file was a memo signed by a woman with the initials, MD effective March 1990. This program is to be dissolved. All remaining subjects are to be reassigned or terminated. No further research authorized. Destroy physical archives after May 1st. Report any external inquiries to the Department of State Integrity Office. Deny all knowledge. It hadn't worked. The archives weren't destroyed. The children weren't forgotten. Not all of them. Subject 5 had survived. So had others. And now, after 36 years of silence, they were no longer hiding. June 9th, 2023. Location, Chicago, Illinois. Public Inquiry Commission on State Care Institutions. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters took notes at a fevered pace. Victims, survivors, and relatives filled every seat in the gallery. On the witness stand sat Elena Rivas. Behind her, a screen displayed a title, the 3619C Program, State-Sanctioned Abuse in Foster Systems, 1985 to 1990. Her voice didn't waver. There is no statute of limitations on truth. These children were not lost. They were selected, processed, used. She held up a photo, the Polaroid of the boy with hollow eyes. Subject 5 led us to the truth. He remembered everything, even when no one believed him, even when no one gave him a name. The commission chair leaned in. Are you saying this program still exists? No, Rivas said. I'm saying the damage still does. The room fell into silence as a man stepped forward. Mid-40s, weathered face, gentle posture. No name badge, no prepared statement. He approached the microphone and paused. Cameras clicked. My name is Thomas, he said. You knew me as Subject 2. Gasps rippled through the room. I survived. I was relocated twice. They tried to erase my memory, make me start over, but I remembered my brother's name. I remembered the sound of the red door locking. He held up a crumpled photo. A girl in pigtails. She didn't make it. Her name was Laurel. She was 6. I remember her voice. The room stood still as Thomas turned to the commission. Tell me what to do with that memory, because it's the only thing that still belongs to me. In the months that followed, an independent task force reopened 13 closed case files tied to former group homes across Illinois. 6 of them showed nearly identical patterns. Lost children, sealed basements, missing tapes, quiet funding trails. A new grave site was uncovered in a churchyard in southern Missouri. A partial registry was recovered in Iowa. Survivors began speaking out, some under new names, others still using their subject numbers. No one could account for them all. Some were never found. But the silence was broken. As for Subject 5, no one ever came forward to claim the identity publicly. But a package arrived at the Carter Ridge Police Department one rainy morning. Inside, a single cassette tape. On it, the now familiar voice. "This is the last message. I did what I could. I kept the names, I kept the stories, not all of them. But enough to make it real again. Let them know we were here. Let them know we lived. That's all we ever wanted." The tape clicked off. Rivas returned to Simmons' property one final time. Grass had begun to grow where the house once stood. A chain-link fence now surrounded the plot, with a sign, "Future site of the Laurel Dorsey Memorial Garden, in memory of the forgotten children." She sat on the curb in silence. The wind passed through the tall weeds. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang noon. Not every child had been rescued. Not every truth had come to light, but enough had. And sometimes, enough was all the dead ever asked for.